Beneath the hush of moonlight and the echo of distant temple bells, there are stories that sleep, forgotten by the living, but never by the dead. Welcome to Whispers of Asia, where ancient rites, forsaken chants, and karmic echoes rise in candlelit silence. In this place, we do not shout to awaken fear. We whisper. Tonight, we enter the stone heart of a mountain monastery, where monks once dared to speak to the other side, not through prayers, but through a chant forbidden for generations. A chant that did not stay in the throat, it crossed the veil, and what came back never truly left. This is the chant that awoke the dead.
The path to Mount Nyum was steep, carved from crumbling stone and time. It wound like an old thought through the forest, narrowing as it climbed until the trees gave way to mist and rock. And at its end, there stood the monastery. Not grand, not gilded, but still and solemn, like a closed eye that had long ago stopped dreaming. Kien arrived just before dusk. He was not the first orphan boy to seek refuge here, nor would he be the last. He carried no belongings but a letter, a shaved head, and the silence of someone who had already lost too much to words. A senior monk greeted him at the wooden gate with a bow. His robes were simple, the color of aged clay, and his voice was like leaves scraping along stone. "No speaking until the first candle," the monk said. "Silence is the offering." Kien nodded, lowering his eyes. He expected stillness, expected solitude, but what awaited him was something far deeper. Not absence, but presence, as though the walls themselves were listening. The monks led him through the outer courtyards, where cracked tiles bore the fading lines of prayers long weathered by rain, past the library, where scrolls slept in wooden ribs, past the incense hall, where smoke twirled toward beams without ever dispersing, and finally to his quarters, a small cell with a straw mat, a bowl, and nothing else. It was here, beneath the golden hue of twilight, that Kien first heard it. A whisper. Not a voice exactly, not in any tongue he knew. It rose and faded like breath on glass. It came not from his room, but from above, far above, where the great iron bell hung in the center of the temple courtyard. He paused, still barefoot, a chill crawling across the arches of his feet. It came again, a soft, rhythmic murmur, almost like humming, almost like chanting, but too quiet, too broken, as if something ancient were trying to remember itself aloud. That night, Kien lay awake on his mat. He stared at the cracked ceiling, traced by the crawling veins of age and heat. The other novices were silent in their chambers, their breaths slow and synchronized, like one great sleeping creature. And still, that sound, the whisper beneath the bell. In the morning, he asked nothing. The rules were clear. Questions were frowned upon, and curiosity was a form of pride. But on the third night, the bell chimed. Once, low and long. It rang at precisely 3:13 a.m., the hour no prayers were given and no lamps were lit. Kien sat up, heart loud in his chest. He crept to his small window. There it was, the bell, massive, motionless, Not a single monk in the courtyard, yet he could feel its hum in his booms. The air carried a strange scent, wax, smoke, and something like wet paper. The next morning, he approached Brother Tren, an older monk who often swept the corridors in silence. "Does the bell ring at night?" Qian asked quietly, folding his hands. Brother Tren did not look up. "No one touches the bell after sundown," he said, "not even the abbot." "Then who rings it?" The monk paused. His broom froze mid-sweep. "Don't ask about the bell," he whispered, then resumed sweeping, though his hands trembled faintly. Qian returned to his chores, but his thoughts were no longer his own. He began to notice things he hadn't before. The way the older monks avoided the courtyard after dusk, the melted wax on the steps beneath the bell, always fresh, the faint smell of incense where no sticks had burned. One evening, after the final chants and extinguished candles, he lingered. The moon was low, swollen like a pale eye over the mountains. Qian crept barefoot into the courtyard, shadows stretching across the stone like long fingers. The bell loomed above him, suspended by chains wrapped in cloth, as though the monks feared the sound of metal. He looked up. Its surface was etched with symbols he could not read, old, weather-worn, filled with dust. And then he heard it, a whisper, a chant, not in one voice, but many, layered over one another like waves on sand. He stepped closer. The sound came from inside the bell, as though something lived there. A breath caught in his throat. Then silence, sudden and absolute. The kind of silence that doesn't wait for sound. It buries it. Qian backed away, slowly, careful not to make a sound. But before he reached the hallway, he turned back once more. And there, just for a moment, he saw the shape of someone kneeling in front of the bell, robed, still, too still. He blinked. The shape was gone. The next day, Qian asked the abbot directly. The old man sat in the prayer hall, fingers resting on a worn set of beads. His eyes were nearly closed, as if dreaming with the world still awake. Qian bowed. "I heard chanting last night, from the bell," he said softly. The abbot's fingers tightened around the beads, but he did not open his eyes. "There are echoes in this place," the old man said. "Some are meant to fade, others are not." Qian hesitated. "Is it true there are forbidden rites? Prayers that shouldn't be spoken?" At this, the abbot finally looked at him. His eyes were dark, not cruel, but full of something vast, like someone who had once seen too far. "There is a wing of this temple we no longer enter, a chamber used to guide souls across the veil." "Why was it sealed?" "Because someone listened." "Listened to what?" The abbot's voice dropped to a whisper. "To what answered back." And with that, he closed his eyes again, dismissing him without words. Qian walked back through the stone halls, his bare feet echoing against the floor. The wind had shifted. It carried a weight now, a promise. That night, the bell rang again, twice, and someone whispered his name. The temple had no clocks, yet time flowed like incense, slow, circular, soft around the edges. Each morning was marked by the rhythm of chanting, each night by the extinguishing of lamps. Days became breaths, hours steps, and in that stillness, Unken began to drift between the present and something older. He couldn't sleep, not because of fear, but because something in him had awakened. Since the second toll of the bell, the air around the monastery had changed. It was subtle, like breath behind the neck, or a shadow that moved when no one did. The silence was heavier. Candles burned faster, and behind his eyelids, Kien saw flickers of parchment and flame. On the fourth night, the moon was thin and distant, a silver lash across the black sky. The monks had completed their evening chants. The prayer drums had ceased. The last flame was pinched out with a whisper. And yet Kien stayed awake, staring at the wooden beam above his bed, where cobwebs clung like forgotten threads. He rose. Barefoot, he stepped into the hall, guided only by memory and the faint scent of sandalwood. The monastery was dark, but not blind. Moonlight trickled through slits in the walls, casting long fingers across the stone floor. He moved like a shadow among shadows, not toward the bell this time, toward the old wing. The monks had forbidden it. The abbot had warned him, but something stronger than fear pulled at his spine, a tether of grief, of memory. His mother's voice had not returned since the second toll, and he longed to hear it again, even if it wasn't truly her. The hallway leading to the old wing had been blocked by an ancient tapestry. It was embroidered with lotus petals, and scripture faded into the silk. Most novices ignored it. Kien did not. He stepped behind it. A draught brushed his cheek, cold, stale, like breath from behind stone. There was a narrow passage, unseen unless one knew where to look, carved not by design, but by time. A path of disuse. He followed it. The floor sloped downward slightly. The air thickened. The silence deepened. And then, a door. Simple, wooden, without a handle. But the wood was stained, not with rot, but wax. Hardened drips along its frame. Marks where candles once wept. Kien pressed against it. It opened with a whisper, the kind that wasn't a sound, but a feeling on the skin. The chamber beyond was small, circular, the ceiling arched like the inside of a bell. Along the walls were shelves, bowed under the weight of scrolls, hundreds, maybe thousands. Their spines were blackened, edges frayed by ash and age. But one stood out. It was bound not in parchment, but cloth, crimson, laced with faded gold thread. A talisman was tied across it with black string, marked with characters Kien had never seen. It called to him. He stepped forward, lifted it gently, and felt the weight of something not meant to be touched. The cloth crinkled as he untied the binding. The scroll unfurled, slow and crackling like dry leaves in fire. Inside were verses written in a language older than the temple itself. But scrawled beneath them, in ink darker than blood, was a translation in trembling modern script. The voice that crosses the veil. Rite of final chanting, to be spoken only once, to be heard only by the dead, to be completed before the final bell tolls. Ken's mouth dried. He traced a finger along the first line, not reading it aloud, but mouthing it silently. Even that made the air shift. It felt like a prayer spoken beneath water, heavy, slow, distorted. He heard a sound behind him. He turned. No one, but the candles on the far shelf, the ones that hadn't been lit in years, were now glowing softly. He did not light them, and in their light, shadows danced. A form shifted behind one shelf. He blinked. Gone. The silence snapped back, thick and cold. Clutching the scroll to his chest, Kien stepped backward, heart pounding. As he did, his heel struck something, a bowl. It rolled away, clinking against the wall. And then, from somewhere deeper in the shelves, came a sound that did not belong. Breathing. Not labored, not close, just steady, measured. He ran, back through the passage, through the tapestry, into the warm safety of the hallway, and then only then did he look down. The scroll was still in his hands. Its wax seal had broken. He hurried to his chamber and buried it beneath his robes. Sleep did not come. At morning prayer, he felt eyes on him, not from the monks, but from behind the statues, from within the cracks in the walls. The sacred drum sounded hollow. The chants lost their rhythm. At breakfast, he sat beside Brother Twen, who avoided his gaze. "Have you ever heard of a chant meant for the dead?" he whispered. Twen flinched. "Where did you hear that?" I didn't. I just..." He hesitated. "Dreamed it." Twen leaned closer, voice barely audible. "There was a rite, long before our time, not spoken for centuries, only used once, during the Black Famine." Ken's breath caught. "They say the monks tried to ease the pain of souls taken too soon, that the chant opened something, but what came through was not peace. Then why keep the scroll?" Twen's eyes darkened. "Because destroying it would make it louder." That night, Kien returned to his room and laid out the scroll by candlelight. The wax had crumbled completely. The seal was gone. He read it fully now, not aloud, but into his memory. Each line felt like a drop of ink into still water, spreading, sinking, staining everything beneath. The final line made his fingers tremble. Once heard, the veil listens back. Speak with devotion, or suffer the echo. Outside, the bell rang. Once, then twice. Then a third time. Kien froze. The flame of his candle shivered and then split, 2 tongues of fire on one wick. And in the space between them, just for a heartbeat, he saw his mother's face. Eyes closed, mouth whispering something he couldn't hear. When he blinked, the flame returned to 1, but her voice remained, not as sound, but as memory so strong it hummed in his bones. She was waiting, and he had found the way. Morning came, but it brought no light. A mist had gathered around the temple, thick and pale as bone dust. The sun tried to rise, but its rays dissolved into the fog. The bells were silent. Even the birds had vanished. Kien sat cross-legged before his unlit candle, the forbidden scroll hidden beneath his robe. His hands shook, though the air was still. He could still feel it, that vibration beneath his skin, as if the verses themselves were alive, moving through his blood. The abbot's voice echoed faintly from the main hall. Morning chants had begun. The other monks' voices rose and fell in rhythm, a tide of devotion. But Kien could not join them. Not now. Not after what he'd seen. He reached beneath the mat and drew out the scroll. Its fabric covering was damp with his sweat. When he unrolled it, the ink seemed darker than before, almost glistening as though wet. Each character trembled slightly in the morning light, and between the lines, faint stains of something else. Ash. He ran his thumb across one mark, and the scent rose immediately. Burnt paper and something sweet. Lotus oil. Funeral incense. The scripture was not copied from another. It was born from ceremony, written during the rite itself. The words were not just language, they were residue. He began to study it by rhythm rather than meaning, tracing the pattern of breath the writer must have used, the pauses, the crescendos. He mouthed them softly, without sound, until he reached the center stanza. There, the ink shifted color, red to black, and a note had been added in smaller script. To chant is to knock. To hear is to be answered. But to answer is to open. Kien's lips parted. He looked again at the characters. They seemed to pulse faintly in the corner of his vision. He blinked, and they stilled. Suddenly, footsteps outside his door. He rolled up the scroll instantly, heart racing. Brother Tren slid the door open and peered inside. His face looked older this morning, drawn, waxy. His eyes carried the weariness of someone who had dreamed too long. "Come," he said quietly. "The abbot calls everyone to the courtyard." Kien rose, trying not to meet his gaze. In the courtyard, the fog lay low like a sleeping thing. The monks stood in two lines before the great bell, their breaths misting faintly in the air. The abbot sat near the altar, eyes closed, hands folded over his beads. Before him lay a small wooden box, wrapped in black cloth. Kien recognized it instantly. A spirit box, used only in funerals, never within temple walls. The abbot opened it. Inside was a broken set of prayer beads, still wet with morning dew. "One of our brothers did not rise for morning chant. Kien has joined the silence," the abbot said softly. A murmur rippled through the crowd, grief without sound. The abbot continued. "He was found kneeling in his cell. No mark, no wound, just still." Kien's stomach turned cold. He had heard the bell last night, only once, right before the candle beside his bed went out. The abbot's gaze swept across the crowd. It lingered for a heartbeat on Kien, long enough for something wordless to pass between them. After the ceremony, Brother Tren approached him again with his voice trembling. "Did you hear it last night?" he whispered. Kien said nothing. "The bell," he hissed. "It rang once, but no one pulled the cord." Kien looked toward the tower. The great iron bell loomed silently, the chains wrapped tight, and yet he could still hear it, faint, like memory vibrating through bone. He swallowed. I think it calls when it wants to," he murmured. Tren's eyes widened. "Don't say such things. That's how it begins." That evening, Kien was assigned to clean the library, a chamber rarely entered, where the oldest scrolls were kept. The candlelight trembled as he dusted each shelf. Rows upon rows of ancient sutras watched him from the shadows. At the far end stood a locked cabinet, sealed with twin charms. One was half torn, likely by age, but perhaps by purpose. Curiosity pulled him closer. He leaned near, squinting at the faint characters. Do not combine the living voice with the voice of the veil. He felt his pulse quicken. The phrase matched one line from his stolen scroll. He pressed an ear to the cabinet door. Inside, silence. Then, a whisper. Not loud, not sharp, soft like wind through reeds, but unmistakably human. Words too old to be understood, murmured in a rhythm that matched the chant. He stepped back, breath shallow. Kien. The whisper came again, but this time it was his name. The candle flame shrank to a pin of blue. He stumbled away, nearly knocking over a stack of scrolls. The sound echoed like a shout through the silent hall. Moments later, the door slid open. The abbot entered. His expression did not change when he saw the fallen scrolls, nor when he noticed Keen's trembling hands. He simply looked at the cabinet, then at Keen. "You've been near it," the old man said. Keen bowed deeply, voice shaking. "I meant no harm, master. I only—" "Curiosity. It is the first chant of the untrained mind." He stepped closer, his eyes ancient pools of sorrow. "You have seen what must remain unseen." Keen dared to lift his gaze. "The scripture, what is it?" The abbot's silence was answer enough, but when he finally spoke, it was like a confession meant for the air, not the boy. "Long ago," he said, "there was famine. Villages burned, bodies unburied. The monks of this temple sought to ease the dead by calling their names across the veil. The chant worked. They answered." He paused, his voice lowering to a near whisper. But when the chant ended, the voices did not fade. They lingered. They spoke back, and those who listened too long were hollowed out. He turned away, the light catching the edge of his prayer beads. "Now the words are sealed. The scroll you seek, the one you should not have found, was the scripture of that chant." Keen froze. "Then you know of it?" "I know that it was buried behind 30 vows of silence." Keen hesitated. "Why not destroy it?" The abbot's hand tightened on his beads. "Because destruction is a form of worship." He motioned to the door. "Return to your cell, and if you hear the bell again, do not answer it." That night, the wind howled over the mountain. The lamps flickered in the corridors. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing. Keen sat before the scroll once more. He should have burned it, thrown it into the river, anything. Yet he couldn't. Because within its ink he had felt something true, something that knew his grief. He thought of his mother, her thin hands, the way she whispered prayers to empty space before dawn, the way she died before he could say goodbye. He traced the first line of the chant with his finger, not daring to speak it. The script seemed to breathe. The air grew heavy. Then, a faint sound. A voice. His mother's voice. Soft, trembling, impossibly near. "My son." He turned. The cell was empty.
Why do you weep for me?" His throat tightened. Tears blurred the candlelight. "Mother, you called me." Her voice came from everywhere and nowhere. The candle flame bent sideways, as if in wind, yet the air was still. "You knocked. Now I must answer." The sound faded. The silence that followed was worse than the voice, deep, swollen, unending. And then the bell rang once. A low, impossible note that trembled through the wood, through the air, through him. When it stopped, the candle went out. But in the dark, he could still see the words glowing faintly on the scroll, like breathing embers in the shape of prayers.
The candle never relit. No matter how many matches Kian struck, the wick hissed and curled away from flame as though afraid. He sat alone in the dark, scroll unfurled in front of him like a wound on the floor. His mother's voice had vanished, but not its residue. Her words still echoed behind his ribs, not as sound, but as ache. "You knocked. Now I must answer." He had only whispered the words in his heart. He hadn't spoken them aloud. He hadn't meant to summon anything. And yet the veil had moved. The bell had rung. Something had crossed. Morning came without dawn. The fog outside the monastery had thickened to a wall, swallowing the sun entirely. The temple grounds were dim, colorless, bathed in blue-gray shadows. During breakfast, no one spoke, not out of discipline, but discomfort. Even the clatter of bowls sounded muffled, like sound itself was being wrapped in cloth. Brother Truyen approached him at the well. His eyes were bloodshot, voice dry. "I saw my sister last night," he whispered. Kian turned. "What?" "She died when I was 8, but last night I saw her, outside my cell window. She was kneeling, wet, ashen, whispering." Kian's mouth went dry. What did she say? Truyen's hands trembled around the water pail. She kept asking where the chant was. She said it was unfinished. A silence stretched between them. Then Truyen whispered, "Did you do something, Kian?" Kian shook his head slowly. No. He lied. Because how could he explain what he had done? He had not spoken the full chant, only traced its breath in his mind, only a thought, only a longing. But grief does not need permission, and neither does the veil. That evening the bell rang again, not once, but twice. Sharp, cold, final. The sound shook the temple walls. Monks gathered in the courtyard, their faces pale beneath flickering lanterns. The abbot stood beside the bell, unmoving. At his feet lay the body of Brother Hian, mouth agape, hands folded in prayer, face drained of color. There were no wounds, no blood, only ash on his shoulders, as if someone had marked him. Kian backed away into the shadows. He pressed himself against the cold stone and watched as the monks lit incense and whispered final prayers. But as they did, he saw something no one else did. There, beyond the wall of the temple, a figure, not moving, not watching, just standing, shrouded, veiled, its outline barely visible through the fog. It vanished when Kian blinked, but the cold it left behind lingered beneath his skin. He returned to his cell in silence. He unrolled the scroll again. The scripture seemed longer now, as if new lines had appeared, written not in ink, but in waxy smudges, faint, crude, but real. The final stanza was different. If the dead are named, they will come. If they come, they will kneel. If they kneel, you must finish the chant. Kian recoiled. The scroll pulsed under his fingers like a living thing. He remembered his mother kneeling beside the altar in that vision, remembered Truyan's sister, the monk's sudden death, and he understood the chant wasn't a call, it was a door, and he had left it half open. For 3 days he did not sleep, he did not eat. He sat in his chamber and stared at the scroll, trying to forget what he had started. But at night, the voices came, not just his mother's, dozens, hundreds. Some whispered his name, some sang, some wept, some begged. And always, always, they ended the same way. Finish the chant. He began to lose time. He found himself standing outside the bell tower with no memory of walking there. He would wake with ashes on his tongue. On the 6th night, he awoke kneeling in front of the altar, the scroll rolled neatly in his lap. He had no memory of how he got there. At dawn, he went to the abbot. The old man was seated in the incense hall, surrounded by mist. Thin rays of cold light filtered through slatted windows, painting his face with shadows. Kian knelt. "I've done something wrong," he whispered. The abbot opened his eyes slowly. "I read the scripture. I didn't chant it aloud, but I listened. I remembered." The abbot did not scold him. He only asked, "And what answered?" Kian's voice cracked. "My mother." The abbot closed his eyes again. "Love is the loudest knock." Kian whispered, "Can it be undone?" The abbot paused a long time. "Once the dead are stirred, they do not return to silence willingly." The chant was only meant for monks who had fasted 40 days, purified their minds, and entered sacred trance. Even then, most never returned unchanged. Kian's hands tightened in his lap. "But I only meant to hear her again." The abbot sighed. "Intention is not protection. The veil does not judge, it only echoes." That night the monks held a prayer vigil for the lost. They lit 100 candles in the main hall, each a symbol of a soul who had crossed beyond. Kian watched from the threshold, too ashamed to enter. But one candle flickered violently, its flame pulling to the side. Then another, and another. Within seconds, half the flames bent toward the center of the room, as if drawn by breath, and a sound rose, faint but growing. Chanting. But no one was chanting. Kian's knees buckled. It was the same rhythm as the scripture, the same sacred pulse, but it was being sung by voices not present, from the floor, from the walls, from beneath. The abbot rose. "Everyone out," he said calmly. "Now!" The monks obeyed. Kian remained frozen. Then from the farthest candle, a figure rose. Not stepped, not walked, rose. Its form was veiled in smoke, its face blurred by light. It began to kneel. The abbot placed a hand on Kian's shoulder and whispered, "You must not answer it." But he heard it speak, not out loud, but in his mind. "You called me. Now finish what you began." The figure sank to the floor. The candles went out. The bell rang once. Later, the scroll was gone. Kian searched his room, the library, even the sealed cabinet, but it had vanished, until he returned to the altar. There it was, unrolled, resting in front of the incense bowl. But this time, the chant was complete. The missing lines, the reversed verses, the final breath,
all there, waiting.
It rang again, not once, but twice, at precisely 3:13 in the morning. The sound was deeper than before, not a chime, but a summons. It rolled through the stone corridors like distant thunder, rattling dust from old beams, awakening something older than time. An Kien sat upright in the dark, heart pounding. The scroll lay open in front of him. He had not meant to fall asleep beside it, but the bell had called, and something inside him had heard it. He rose without thought. His body moved before his mind, bare feet against cold stone, fingers trembling as they touched the doorframe. The air was colder than any night prior, as if the temple itself was exhaling frost. Outside, the fog had thickened to a living thing. It swirled low over the tiles, clinging to the statues like burial shrouds. In the center of the courtyard, the bell swayed gently. No monk stood beside it. No hand had touched the rope, and yet it had rung. Twice. Kien stepped closer. He shouldn't have, but he did. His eyes burned, and his hands felt heavy, as if weighed down by invisible ash. The closer he moved to the bell, the more the air resisted him, thick like water, cold like regret. He paused a few paces away, watching the bell. It no longer moved, but there was something beneath it, a shape, kneeling. His breath caught. At first he thought it was another monk. Then the fog shifted, and he saw her, his mother. Her back was to him, her hair falling long and damp down her back, just as it had when he was a child. Her robe was torn and soaked, clinging to her like a second skin. She was kneeling, still, silent. "Mother," Kien whispered. She did not turn, did not speak, but her head moved, just slightly, a slow, reverent bow. She was waiting for him to finish what had begun. He stepped forward. Each footfall was an act of betrayal. Every step felt like walking away from the world he knew, towards something that had no name, no boundary. As he neared her, the bell pulsed again, not with sound, but with pressure. His ears rang, and a faint whisper echoed through his chest. "Complete the chant." She lifted her head, slowly, so slowly, and turned. Kien froze. Her face, it was hers, but not hers. Her eyes were vacant, her skin pale as river clay. Her mouth was moving, but no sound escaped, not breath, not life, just motion, forming the words of the chant. Her lips moved in rhythm, the very rhythm he had memorized, the one burned into the scroll. He fell to his knees. Tears welled in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Then finish it," her voice said, not aloud, but in his thoughts, cold and calm. "If you called me back, don't leave me halfway." He couldn't move, but the wind did. It rose suddenly, violently, scattering incense ash from the altar across the courtyard like a funeral storm. The bell swayed again, chains groaning against stone. Other figures emerged from the fog, more kneeling. One by one they appeared, robed silhouettes, heads bowed, unmoving. The courtyard filled with them, dozens of them, maybe more. None spoke, none breathed. They only kneeled, all facing the altar, all waiting, all echoing one truth. The chant was incomplete. At dawn, the monks found Kien unconscious on the courtyard floor. He was surrounded by faint footprints, barefoot, wet, though no rain had fallen. The abbot knelt beside him. He did not wake Kien, not immediately. Instead, he looked toward the bell, then toward the sky, and whispered, "It has begun again." Kien awoke in the infirmary. The scroll was beside him, rolled and tied with red string, but something had changed. The string was not cloth, it was hair, human. He recoiled, tossing it aside. The scroll hit the floor with a hollow sound. Brother Tuen stood in the doorway, silent. Kien met his eyes. "How many times has it rung?" "Twice," Tuen said. "We fear a third." Kien tried to rise, but his limbs were weak. "There are people coming, spirits, from the veil. They kneel. They want me to finish it." Tuen did not argue, did not laugh. He only whispered, "Then you must not. Let them kneel forever, but do not finish the chant." Kien's hands shook. "But what if they don't stay kneeling? What if they rise?" Tuen looked down. "That is what happened last time." That night the abbot called a meeting. Every monk, young and old, was summoned to the prayer hall. Candles were lit, doors sealed, offerings placed in every corner of the room. The abbot spoke. "There is a rite that was never meant to return, a door once opened in desperation, never truly shut. One among us has found its scripture. One among us has awakened its memory." He did not say Kien's name. He did not have to. The air around him was heavy with guilt, but no one looked at him with anger, only fear. The abbot continued, "3 tolls is the limit, 1 to warn, 2 to invite, and the 3rd to open." He faced the monks. "If it tolls a 3rd time, the veil will not simply thin, it will tear." That night, Kien returned to his cell. He dared not touch the scroll. But still, it lay on his mat, retied, unmoved. The red string pulsed faintly in the candlelight, like something still breathing. He prayed, not the chant, not the scripture, just a boy's prayer, to the sky, to whatever listened. "Please," he whispered. "I just wanted to say goodbye. I didn't mean to bring her back." Silence. Then, "But she came." The voice was not his mother's. It was male, older, colder, close. He turned, but no one was there. Just the shadow of the bell tower looming through the window, and something at its base, kneeling, watching. The kneeling forms did not disappear with morning. They lingered in the memory of every monk, quiet figures that were never truly seen, but whose presence clung like incense in the lungs. Whispers followed Kien wherever he walked, not spoken by others, spoken by the walls, by the floor, by the very breath between bells. You summoned, they answered. Finish. He no longer trusted silence. It was filled with too much sound. 3 monks went missing within 2 days. One never returned from sweeping the East Garden. One disappeared from the meditation chamber during midnight prayer. And one, Brother Truyen, simply vanished. His cell empty, his bowl untouched, a line of ash across his pillow. No one spoke his name aloud, but everyone felt it. Kien felt it most of all. He sat outside the bell tower that night, knees tucked to his chest, eyes locked on the chain-wrapped gong. It hadn't moved in hours, but he could still feel it, vibrating faintly through the stone, as though the bell were dreaming or listening. In the dreams that followed, Kien saw the procession, always the same, monks in robes that dripped with river water, walking barefoot through the temple halls. They did not look at him. They did not speak. They chanted, slowly, steadily, in that rhythm now etched into his bones. He followed them. through corridors he had never entered, past prayer rooms sealed in wax, down stone steps that seemed to spiral forever. At the bottom was a door, not carved, not wooden, but made of bone. Its hinges were hair, its knob was a rosary of teeth. When it opened, he awoke, sweating, trembling, and every time the scroll was closer to his bed. On the 7th night, the abbot summoned Chant alone. The incense hall was dark. Only one candle burned between them. The abbot's hands were folded, but he looked exhausted, as though he had been holding the world back with nothing but prayer. "I have seen the shadows," he said softly. "They kneel where our ancestors were buried. They weep with no mouths. You have opened the veil." Chant bowed, ashamed. "I didn't know it would stay open." The abbot studied him. "That is the nature of doors, easy to open, difficult to close." He reached beneath his robe and placed an object on the floor. A wax seal, red, cracked. "It was once placed upon the scripture, before you found it." Chant stared at it. "Why wax?" "Because flesh forgets, but wax remembers." He leaned forward, voice lower now. "There is a way to end this, but it comes with a cost." Chant looked up. "What cost?" But the abbot said nothing, only handed him a small vial of white ash. "Burn what was never meant to be read, then seal the flame with this." Chant held the vial in his hands. It was warm, alive. That night, he did not dream. He walked. Down the candle-lit halls, scroll clutched to his chest, the vial held tightly in his other hand. He made his way to the old altar, the place where the scripture had first spoken to him. The fog was thick, but the path was clear, as though something had cleared it for him. He reached the stone brazier, placed the scroll within it, lit the match. Flame rose. For a moment, it was just paper, ink, nothing more. But as the scroll began to burn, it screamed. Not a sound through air, but a sound through soul. A pressure that pressed into his chest like grief made solid. The fire turned black, then blue, then white. The air grew thick, the shadows shifted, and all at once, he was not alone. The figures returned, kneeling, dozens, hundreds. Their mouths were open now, and from every mouth the chant, "Thy words were spoken, we answered, do not abandon." He opened the vial. The ash trembled inside. He tried to pour it onto the flame, but his hands froze. Because standing across from him, among the kneeling dead, was Brother Chant. His robes torn, his eyes gone, but his voice still his. "You left it incomplete." "I didn't know what it would cost." Chant's head tilted. "Then offer what remains." Chant turned to flee, but the shadows moved, and when he looked down, they were kneeling around him now, not before him, not after him, but circling him. A ring of souls, heads bowed, waiting. he did not burn the scroll. He could not, because when he tried to, the flame flickered, and in its glow he saw his mother again, this time standing. She was smiling, but her mouth was too wide, her hands too long, her feet did not touch the ground. "Just finish it," she said, and her voice was no longer hers. And then, in unison, they all whispered, "Let the bell toll thrice." Kien ran, through the mist, through the dark, through the temple's bones. He did not stop until he reached the bell tower, and there, beneath it, was the scroll, unburned, waiting, open to the final verse. And beside it was a candle, already lit.
There were ceremonies meant to be performed only once. The words are remembered, the rhythm recorded, but the act itself must remain unspoken, unrepeated, because each time it is repeated, it echoes louder, and echoes do not die. They return, changed, hungrier. That morning, the monastery awoke to strange order. The incense burners were already lit. Fresh lotus petals had been scattered along the altar steps. Red wax had been dripped in perfect lines, not by human hand, but as if poured by memory itself. The monks whispered among themselves. No one had prepared the ceremonial grounds. No one admitted to lighting the sacred fire. And yet, everything was in place, exactly as it had been the last time, exactly as it had been during the chant. An Kien stood at the doorway to the courtyard and stared at the bell. The candle still burned at its base, and beside it, the scroll, unrolled, held open by ash-damp stones. He didn't remember placing it there, but he had stopped trusting memory. In the hallway beside him, he heard chanting, faint, disjointed, out of sync, like many mouths trying to match the same breath. He turned the corner. There, in the prayer chamber, the monks were gathered, but not all were chanting. Some were silent, still, their robes too dark, their skin too pale, their presence too cold. Mixed among the living were the kneeling dead, and no one could tell them apart. Kien fled to the abbot's quarters. The door was ajar. Inside, the scroll cabinet was wide open, the protective seals peeled away like skin. And on the floor, more scrolls, not just the chant, but others, forgotten rites, buried psalms, scriptures that had not seen light in 100 years, all of them open, all of them whispering. He fell to his knees. "Father Abbot," he called out, voice breaking, "they are repeating the ceremony, without choice, without knowing." From the shadows, a voice answered, "They know." The abbot stepped into the light. His eyes were bloodshot, his robe was soaked in river water, his hands trembled not from age, but from what he had seen. "I tried to stop it years ago, when the chant was first sealed." "You were there?" Kien asked, stunned. "I was the last to speak it. I was only a novice then, like you." He sat slowly, as if the act itself exhausted him. "We called them out of grief, out of love, out of devotion." He looked at Kien with sorrowful eyes. "They came willingly, but would not leave." Kien's voice cracked. "What do they want?" The abbot answered without blinking. "Continuity." That evening the wind changed. It no longer passed through the trees. It circled the bell tower. It hissed through corridors like breath through cracked teeth. Candles flickered in rhythm, not with nature, but with memory. The temple was repeating itself, not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. The steps of the monks echoed at the same tempo as the first chant. Doors opened and shut on their own. Chimes rang with no hand to guide them. Kien sat at the altar watching it all. And then the drums, funeral drums. 3 slow strikes, then silence, then 3 again. It was the rite of passage, the old crossing ceremony. But it was not scheduled. No one had requested it. No one had admitted to lighting the sacred fire. Yet everything was in place. In the courtyard, the monks gathered, not in fear, but as if pulled by strings of remembrance. They stood in rows, lit candles, faced the altar, and the chanting began. But this time, the words were not in their voices. They came from below, from beneath the tiles, from the bones beneath the temple. The ground vibrated gently, as if hundreds of mouths beneath the stone were forming each syllable in perfect harmony. Kien covered his ears, but the chant entered his mind. It pulsed behind his eyes. It filled his veins. The abbot joined him at the edge of the steps. "They've completed it," he said softly. "What happens now?" Kien asked, trembling. The abbot did not answer. He simply stepped forward and lit the final candle at the bell's base. And then he knelt. One by one, the monks followed, all of them, including the ones who had gone missing, including Brother Truen. Kien stared, unable to move. The abbot looked over his shoulder one last time and said, "It is better to kneel willingly than to be dragged." And then, silence. He was the only one left standing. Every other monk was on their knees, their heads bowed, their hands in prayer. The bell began to sway. Its sound did not come from metal on wood. It came from within. A resonance, a song, and with every movement, the air shifted. The veil thinned. He felt it like skin pulling from bone, like waking from death. And from the bell's mouth, a sound spilled forth, not loud, but endless. It is not a chant, it is a memory. He dropped to his knees. The scroll was in his hands. He didn't remember picking it up. The ink had changed again, now glowing faintly, pulsing with something warm and wrong. He stared at the final verse. "If the chant is completed, they will not need to kneel." He looked around. They were all waiting, eyes open now, mouths closed, still but expectant. He opened his mouth and spoke the first line. The flame touched the offering, but it did not burn. It licked the surface of the paper like a tongue tasting ash, then recoiled, sputtering into nothingness. Again Keen struck the match. Again he held it to the scripture. Again, nothing. The fire refused. The scroll refused. The rite refused. Because something deeper had already accepted it. The courtyard was still full of kneeling figures. Some were breathing, some were not, and now it was impossible to tell which was which. Keen stood alone, scroll in hand. Candles all around him still burned, but they no longer gave warmth. The abbot remained kneeling at the front of the line, unmoving, like stone carved in prayer. Keen's voice was hoarse from the chant he had begun, and yet the silence after it felt louder than any bell. He carried the scroll into the inner sanctum, to the cremation pit, the furnace used to return the dead to smoke and memory. It was sacred and old and warm. He placed the scroll inside the pit, added herbs, oil, petals, then struck the flame. The fire bloomed, but the scroll remained whole, untouched, even as the heat cracked stone. The scripture did not curl, did not blacken, did not even smoke. It would not burn, because it had become truth, and truth cannot be destroyed. From behind him came footsteps, slow, wet, heavy. He turned. One of the monks stood there, or rather, what was once a monk. The robe was right, but the skin beneath it was wrong, too smooth, too pale, too silent. It said nothing, it only pointed to the fire. And in that moment, Keen understood. "It is not meant to burn," he whispered. "It is meant to endure." The monk nodded once, then turned and walked into the shadows, vanishing like smoke that never rose. Keen pulled the scroll from the fire. It was warm to the touch, but not hot. He unrolled it again, and there, at the bottom, a line he had never seen, written in red, still wet. "The chant is not an ending, it is an invitation." He ran to the abbot, shook him gently. The old man opened his eyes. They were not afraid, just tired. "I spoke the first verse. They're waiting for the rest. If I complete it—" "You join them," the abbot whispered. Keen hesitated. "Then what happens?" The abbot looked toward the bell. "It tolls for the last time." That night, the sky above the monastery opened. Not with lightning, not with rain, with light. But not the light of heaven, not the warmth of dawn. A pale, directionless glow, as if the moon had split into 1,000 eyes. The mist cleared only upward, as if something was watching from above or waiting to descend. And below, the bell trembled. Chains groaned, stone cracked, but it had not rung, not yet. In the main hall, the monks gathered again. This time they chanted without prompting. No scrolls, no fire, just memory. Their voices were in unison, but it was not devotion. It was memory. The kind of memory that survives the body. The abbot stood, robes falling from his shoulders like old bark. He raised a single hand, and the chanting stopped. He looked at Keen. "You must go beneath the temple." Keen's breath caught. "There's nothing beneath." "There is, where the bones are." He had heard of it only in fragments, whispers from elder monks, tales told during stormy nights when even fire feared the wind. A burial chamber, a chamber of failed rites, a place where the first chant had been sealed with silence. It was said no one had entered in a generation, not because they were forbidden, but because the door would not open unless the chant was remembered. And now it was. The abbot handed him a lantern. Inside it, the flame burned red, not orange, not yellow, red, like blood remembering light. He said nothing more, only turned, knelt once again, and joined the stillness. Keen descended the staircase behind the altar. The air grew colder, then warmer, then wrong. Stone gave way to dirt. Dirt gave way to clay. Clay gave way to bone. He found the door by accident, not carved, not built. It had no hinges, it had no frame. It simply was. A slab of something black, veined like flesh, cold like water from a forgotten well. On its surface, a single mark, the final character of the chant. And when he touched it, the door opened. Behind it, silence. And inside, shadows that did not follow him. The red flame of his lantern barely reached the walls. He stepped into the chamber and saw them. Hundreds, maybe thousands, figures kneeling. Some wore monk robes, some wore funeral garments, some wore nothing but ash. And in the center, a throne made of melted candles. And upon it, the scroll. Not the one he had carried, the original. And around it, wax figures, mouths open, singing without sound. He stepped forward. The ground was soft, warm, breathing. Each step left an imprint that slowly closed behind him, as if the room refused to remember him. He reached the scroll, unrolled it, and saw his own handwriting, his name written at the bottom as the final signature. He did not scream. He simply sat, cross-legged, and began to chant, not because he wanted to, but because the room had already begun, and he was the echo.
The altar had always been the heart of the monastery. It was where the monks offered their prayers, where the incense rose like smoke from the soul, where silence sat thickest like a curtain between worlds. But no one ever looked beneath it. No one asked what stones it was built upon, or what bones lay underneath. Because in places of worship, there are truths too sacred to uncover, or too dangerous. Awoke awoke with wax on his hands. The scent of old tallow clung to his sleeves. His lips were dry, his throat ached. He had been chanting again in his sleep. The scroll lay beside him where he had not left it, open, its edges curled from moisture, its ink still wet. One word glowed faintly in the half-dark: return. He stood in the pre-dawn silence, barefoot. The monastery felt abandoned. No birds sang, no footsteps echoed, no bells rang. He made his way to the main altar. There, in the faint light of an untouched candle, the floor shimmered. Not polished, not damp, but marked. A perfect circle carved into the stone. It had not been there yesterday, but it had always been there. Waiting. He reached for the censer and pulled it aside. Beneath, a crack, thin, jagged, as if something beneath the altar had shifted, had breathed. He knelt, ran his fingers along the edge, and felt warmth, not from fire, but from memory, from below. He returned at dusk with tools, not to break the floor, no, to follow it, to reveal it. Each stone lifted like a tooth from an ancient jaw. Beneath them, packed soil, black and veined with roots long dead. He dug with trembling hands. An hour passed, then two, until finally his fingers struck wood. Not a coffin, not a box, a lid. Round, carved, etched with symbols that matched the final page of the scroll. He brushed the dirt aside. There were no hinges, only pressure. And as his palms pressed down, it opened inward, without resistance, without sound, like a mouth parting for breath. A rush of warm air spilled upward, thick with the scent of burned offerings, old parchment, and something older still. Not decay, remembrance. Kien stared down. A narrow stairway descended into the dark. But the dark was not empty. It shimmered faintly like breath caught between two mirrors. And from below, a sound. Not chanting, not weeping. Breathing. He took a candle, lit it with fire from the altar, and stepped down. The stone steps were soft with moss, the walls close, moist. The air grew warmer as he descended. Each breath felt like inhaling history, like drawing the past into his lungs. He reached the bottom and found a chamber. Circular, hollowed from the earth itself, and in the center, a pool. Still, black, wide as a monk's cell. Not water, oil, or something thicker. Floating atop it, a robe, gray, tattered, stained with ash. And beneath the robe, a shape. Not moving, not decayed, preserved. Ken dropped to his knees. It was a monk, or had been, his hands folded over a small bowl, his lips frozen mid-chant, his eyes open. All around the walls, names had been carved, hundreds, thousands. Some he recognized, many he did not. But the last one was his, freshly carved, still bleeding wax. He stepped closer to the pool. The surface remained undisturbed, but his reflection was wrong. It did not mirror him. It stood still even when he moved, and its mouth was open, chanting. From the dark behind him came movement. Kien turned and saw a figure crawling from the shadows, robes dragging behind them, skin slick with oil, mouth sewn shut with red thread. It held a candle, placed it beside the pool, then bowed, deep, and waited. Another followed, then another, until the chamber was filled with kneeling figures, their mouths silent, their eyes wide, each holding a candle. The flame of each candle burned blue. Together, they began to hum. Low, unholy, beautiful. A harmony of suffering and faith. Kien stepped into the pool. It welcomed him. The oil parted without ripple. It did not stain him, it embraced him. As he walked deeper, the chant grew louder from the walls, from the floor, from his own mouth. The final line of the scripture echoed through the chamber, not from paper, from memory. Let the names be offered, let the breath be shared, let the living kneel for the dead. At the center of the pool, Kien knelt. The oil rose to his chest, the candles dimmed, the air thickened. He reached into the oil, touched the bowl held by the monk underneath. It was warm. As he lifted it, the voice in the chamber spoke, not with words, but with silence. And into that silence, the bell rang 3 times. The oil trembled. The walls shook. The candles blew sideways but did not die. And the figure beneath the surface opened its mouth. Bubbles rose, but no breath, only a whisper. We are awake. The bowl was heavier now, as if it held not oil, but weight.
the weight of names, of vows, of voices that were never meant to return. Aunt Kien held it in his trembling hands, the warmth of the black pool still clinging to his robes like memory. Behind him, the blue candle flames bent low, flickering inward as if bowing to something he could not yet see. The chamber pulsed. The walls did not echo sound, they echoed intention. And now the chamber was full of it. Not devotion, not grief, something older, hungrier, patient. He rose from the pool. The bowl in his hands was empty, yet it sloshed with invisible weight. Each step he took toward the stairs sent a ripple through the air, not through water, through time. The figures along the wall did not move, but their heads turned as he passed, all at once, all toward him, all waiting. As he ascended back toward the altar, he felt it. The chant had been completed, but not fulfilled. The scroll had ended, the ritual had closed, but something remained open. He emerged into the temple proper. It was still night, but the air had changed. It smelled of wax and breath and blood that had not yet been spilled. The abbot was waiting at the threshold. He looked older, much older. His face was pale, lips cracked, eyes rimmed with red. "You went beneath," he said softly. Kian nodded. The abbot's voice trembled. "Did you bring it back?" Kian held up the bowl. The abbot's knees nearly gave out. "You shouldn't have taken it. That bowl was never meant to be touched again. I didn't choose. It chose me." They returned to the main hall. The bell had cracked down the middle. Its chain lay broken on the ground. Ash had spilled across the stone like powder drawn from bone. And the scroll, the one that had once been sealed, now bore a second half. Not written by hand, written by presence. Its ink was darker, redder. It bled. The chant had reversed. Its verses now spoke of giving back what had crossed, of sealing mouths that had opened, of extinguishing candles with breath from the other side. But the final instruction was the clearest. One must chant the reversal, backward, in full, in presence of all who answered. The abbot whispered, "No one has ever survived that chant." Ken looked around the hall. It was no longer empty. Figures had begun to appear again. But these ones were different. Not the veiled kneelers, not the silent shadows. These ones stood, tall, still, watching. Their feet left no trace. Their eyes were blank, and their mouths moved softly, in reverse. He knelt at the altar, spread the scroll out on the floor, and began to read, backward, line by line. The words tangled in his throat. The syllables bit his tongue. It felt like drinking water upstream, unnatural, choking against the pull of everything. But he continued, because with every word, one figure vanished, mouth sealed, memory silenced. He reached the midpoint. His voice cracked. Blood dripped from his nose. The abbot lit a candle beside him, red wax, thick wick, a prayer flame. But it flickered blue, and from it rose a whisper. "Stop." Kien ignored it, read on. One more verse, 2 more, 10 more. And then a monk screamed. Not Kien, not the abbot, one of the others. One of the real ones, still alive. He clutched his chest, collapsed. Smoke poured from his mouth. A figure rose from it, a perfect twin, mouth wide,
eyes hollow, hands folded. It walked to the scroll, placed one finger upon the page, and a new verse appeared under Qian's hand. He didn't write it, but it was written in blood. You cannot return what has remembered your name. Qian froze. His voice faltered. The chant stopped mid-breath. The silence that followed was absolute. And in that silence, the bell tolled. But not from the tower, from beneath the altar, from within the bowl. A low, sick chime that made the stone weep wax. The abbot fell to his knees. His voice rasped. You've gone too far. You finished what was meant to be forgotten, and now it's finishing you. Qian's hands trembled. I just wanted to end it. The abbot looked up. There is no ending, only closing. The final line on the scroll glowed red. Qian read it, out loud. His mouth moved backward. The words distorted, the shadows convulsed, and one by one the candles went out. Not from wind, from breath, from the dead exhaling all at once. Darkness, then silence, then nothing. Not emptiness, absence. When light returned, Qian was alone. The scroll was gone. The bowl was dry. The temple was silent. He stood, walked the courtyard. Not a single figure remained. No monks, no shadows, only ash and a cracked bell that would never ring again. And yet, as he passed the altar, he saw something. A fresh candle, lit, burning, and beside it, a scroll. Not the original, a new one, blank, waiting to be written.
There is a silence that comes after horror. It does not scream, it does not weep, it only waits. Like wax after flame, like breath after prayer, like a temple after its final bell. The monastery stood still. No birds, no wind, no footsteps. An Qian wandered the stone corridors, barefoot and hollow. There were no monks left, no voices in the hall, no abbot in his chamber. Only the faint scent of incense, like memory clinging to the ribs of the air, and the candles, still lit, still burning. Too many, more than had been lit by any living hand. Each flickered gently, as if stirred by breath that was no longer there. He passed through the scripture room. The scrolls had all been unrolled, lined up like ribs across the floor, but their texts were blank, not faded, not erased, just blank. Only one word remained, scrawled in the corner of the wall above the altar: remain. He did not know if it was a command or a curse, or both. He entered the candle hall, a chamber once used for midnight meditation. There were no windows, only shelves, and thousands of candles. He paused. Something was wrong. The candles had been moved. They formed a circle, and in the center, a reflection. Not in glass, not in water, but in flame. The light shaped itself into something familiar. A face. His face. But wrong. Mouth open, eyes shut, as if caught mid-chant. He stepped forward. The candle nearest to him flared,
a sudden breath of blue. And in that moment, he heard the chant again, not through ears, through the candlelight. Each flame whispered a syllable. Each flicker shaped a phrase. Together, they sang, not loudly, not urgently, but patiently, as if they had all the time in the world, because they did, because they were made of it. He moved slowly through the circle. Every candle he passed tilted slightly toward him, flame bending inward, not following, recognizing. Then, one candle went out, just one. Its smoke curled upward like a finger pointing toward the center of the room. He followed. There, in the heart of the light, was a mirror, cracked, dusty, set in the floor. He knelt beside it, peered down, saw nothing, until the candles behind him reflected in the glass a ring of fire. And in the center of the ring, a figure. Not him, another. A monk. Mouth stitched shut. Kneeling. Still. Then, slowly, it looked up. And Chant realized it was not in the reflection. It was beneath it, watching through the crack in the mirror like an eye looking up from the grave. He stumbled back. The flames shivered with him. The door to the candle room creaked closed, not with wind, with breath. He turned. The candles were no longer stationary. They swayed in rhythm, a slow pulse, like a heart that hadn't beaten in years, learning again. The chant returned, this time from his own mouth. He did not speak it. It simply emerged, soft, whispered, remembered. He tried to leave, but the room did not allow it. The door was gone. In its place, a wall of melted wax. The flames began to rise, not higher, deeper, stretching like spines of ancient monks arching toward the ceiling. In their glow, the shadowed corners of the room revealed more figures, dozens, standing behind candles, watching him. Not moving, not alive. Their faces were blurred by heat, but their eyes, he recognized them. They were the monks who had vanished, not consumed, not freed, stored, preserved, in the light, in the chant. He screamed, the flames flinched, then silence, utter, final. Dead. Only one candle remained. It flickered weakly. He crawled toward it, looked into the flame. Inside it, a word. Reverse. He remembered the scroll, the last line. The reversal chant had sealed the door, but not the memory, not the echo. The candle was not a symbol. It was a vessel, a cage for what still whispered beneath. He reached out, touched the wick, and in that moment, all the flames in the room surged. Their light fused. The chamber disappeared, not in fire, in vision. And he saw it, the truth beneath the chant. There was never a ritual for the dead, only for the dying. The chant was never meant to invite spirits in. It was meant to pull souls out, to open the body like a door
and let the memory inside. The chant rewrote those who spoke it, one word at a time, one echo at a time, until nothing remained but firelight and the sound of breath that did not belong to you. Awaken collapsed. The candle went out, and everything went dark. When he awoke, he was no longer in the candle hall. He was in the center of the courtyard, surrounded by hundreds of candles, all lit, all flickering. In the silence, a single line carved into the stone beneath him. You are remembered.
The courtyard was not empty. It only appeared so. For beneath every flame, within every echo, and behind every silence, they waited. Chant sat at the center, surrounded by the circle of candles. They formed a ring, unbroken, each flickering softly, each casting long, reverent shadows across the stone. He had not lit them, but they had lit for him, not in invitation, in expectation. The final scroll lay across his lap. Its parchment was different from the others, not aged, not worn, fresh, but familiar. Because it was not written by monks, it had been written by the ritual itself. Line by line, in sleep, in silence, in breath. It bore his name at the top, not at the bottom. The verses were unlike those before, not in tone, but in direction. These were not meant to reach the dead, nor to banish them, nor to seal them. They were meant for the self, a chant to prepare the soul for merging, for offering, for surrender. Chant stood, the scroll open before him. The candles flared. A wind passed through the monastery, not cold, but warm. It smelled of ash, of wax, of breath caught in old lungs. And then, slowly, the shadows moved. One by one, the monks returned, not from the gates, not from the hall, from nowhere. They stepped into the light, robes damp, eyes closed. Some bore prayer beads, others held incense. All were silent, but their mouths moved, mimicking him. He began the chant. The first word was simple, soft. It barely left his lips before being caught by the wind and carried around the courtyard like a sacred offering. The shadows listened, then echoed, not in unison, but in rhythm. Each monk repeated the line in their own time, their own breath, until the courtyard was a ripple of whispers. He continued, line by line. His voice was steady now, not strong, but surrendered. Each phrase carved from memory, each word drawn from a depth he could no longer name. As he spoke, the world narrowed, not closed, focused. The monastery faded from view. The stones beneath his feet vanished. The sky above dimmed, until there was only the chant and the ring of light. Then, from the far edge of the flame, she appeared, his mother. She did not speak, did not weep. She knelt and pressed her hands together. Behind her the others gathered, not just monks, villagers, children, women, Men, all the lost, all the summoned, all who had once answered. Chant wept, and still he chanted. The final stanza arrived. It was only 3 lines. He paused. The air leaned in listening. The wind stopped. The flames bent toward him. The dead waited. I remember. I return. I remain. He whispered it once, then again, then a 3rd time, until the words were no longer words. They became vibration, tone, resonance, a song without melody, a prayer without promise. The candles began to extinguish, not at once, one by one. With each line of breath, another light went out. With each extinguished flame, another figure faded. His mother smiled, then vanished. Brother Truyan bowed, then dissolved. The abbot remained, last of all. He looked at Kian with quiet eyes, then spoke for the final time. Now, it is yours. And vanished. The last candle remained. Kian stepped toward it. The scroll fell from his hands, its verses complete. The wind returned, soft and warm. He looked down at the flame. It reflected his face, but older, tired, peaceful. He leaned in, blew gently. The candle died, and with it, the chant. No bell rang, no whisper followed, only stillness, the kind that lasts, the kind that fills everything, not with fear, but with silence made sacred. When the sun rose, it rose alone. The monastery stood unchanged, but empty. The altar clean, the scroll gone, the bells silent. And in the courtyard where the stone circle lay, only wax, melted, in the shape of folded hands. The bell no longer hung above the courtyard. Its chain lay snapped in the grass, coiled like a shed serpent skin. The structure that once held it stood fractured, scorched at the top, as if struck by something not of wind nor fire, but memory. The bell itself had fallen, but not with violence, with surrender. It now lay on its side near the edge of the cliff, half buried in soil softened by night rains. Its mouth, once proud and wide, was cracked. Its echo, once feared, was gone. Not silenced, spent. A traveler arrived at dawn. His robe was simple, his face covered by dust. He bore no name, only a map inked by stories told across generations. He had heard of the temple, of its silence, of the bell that had rung for the dead. And he came not for prayer, but for proof. He expected ruin, collapse, decay. What he found was stillness, too perfect, too precise, as though the temple were not abandoned, but finished. He walked the courtyard slowly. There were no footprints, only rings of wax, soft, curled, faintly red, and in the center, a pair of handprints, small, pressed gently into the stone, now solidified like the final seal on a letter never meant to be read. He stood before the bell. Its surface was cool, etched with symbols he did not know. Some had faded, some had deepened, darkened by time or touch or something else. He crouched beside it and placed a hand on the metal. It hummed, soft, so soft it could be mistaken for wind. But it was not wind. It was remembering. Inside the main hall, everything remained intact. Not a scroll was out of place, not a mat disturbed. The altar stood clean, the incense bowls empty. But there were no monks, no chants, no breath, only a note, pinned beneath the polished stone bowl. No ink, no brush, just a line carved by fingernail. Do not listen if it rings again. The traveler turned, and for the first time he noticed the mirrors. Small, simple, set into the corners of the room. Each reflected the altar, but none reflected him. He moved closer, watched, waited, and in the faint shimmer of the glass, he saw a figure kneeling behind him. He spun around. Nothing. He returned to the mirror. The figure was gone, but the candle at the altar was now lit. He had not lit it. It flickered once, then twice, then held steady, burning blue. He backed away slowly, retraced his steps. The bell outside remained fallen, still cracked, still open. And yet, as he stepped beyond the courtyard wall, he heard it. A single chime, far too deep, far too loud, and far too wrong. He turned. The bell had not moved, but the sound had come from its mouth, from within, and in the dirt beside it, a footprint, fresh, bare, leading back toward the temple. The traveler did not return inside. He bowed once toward the gate, lit a stick of incense, and placed it beside the bell. Then he turned and walked back down the winding mountain path. The wind followed him, but not to chase, to remind, to whisper. That night, the villagers below said they saw lights flickering in the monastery, candles moving through the hallways, shadows kneeling in the courtyards, chants carried on the breeze just beneath hearing. But no one went to check, because the bell had rung, and the silence that followed was too perfect to break. In time, nature grew back around the temple. Vines crept up the bell tower skeleton. Moss softened the courtyard stones. Rain pooled in the cracks. The mirrors clouded with dust. The altar withered into itself. But no flame dared light on its own, and no scroll was ever found again. Only one thing remained untouched: the bell, cracked, hollow, but never empty. And once each year, on the coldest night, when the moon is lowest, the bell tolls once. Not for the dead, not for the living, but for the vow, the one whispered in candlelight. spoken backward, remembered forward, a vow never broken.
There are stories that begin with a scream. This one began with a whisper. A boy, a bell, a name remembered too clearly, and a chant, older than scripture, deeper than grief, sung not to the heavens, but to the hollow between life and death. The monastery no longer stands in maps. Its name has faded from records. The path that once led up the mountain has been overgrown by vines, forgotten even by those who live beneath it. But sometimes travelers still come. Not many, and never twice. They speak of silence too complete, of wind that carries breath, of bells that should not ring. They speak of candles that light themselves at dusk, and of shadows that kneel in rows, as if waiting for a ritual that never ends. The chant is never sung aloud anymore, but it is heard, in dreams, in fog, in silence that follows a loved one's final breath, because the veil was torn. And though it was stitched back shut, stitched with ash and wax and vows, the seam still aches, especially in candlelight, especially when a name is spoken in longing, especially when someone asks to hear the dead again. The chant was not meant to harm. It was written in devotion, to comfort, to soothe, to bring peace. But peace cannot be summoned. It must be earned. And the dead do not forget who called them back. The story ends where it began, in a courtyard, surrounded by candles, under a sky too quiet. The bell lies still, its mouth cracked, its voice spent, but it remembers, and in its silence, the chant sleeps, waiting, not for permission, for echo. A child once wandered too far from a nearby village, drawn by the sight of a single flame dancing high on the ridge. She climbed the hill alone, curious, fearless. When she reached the edge of the courtyard, she saw no people, only candles and a book, bound in waxed cloth, tied with a thread of red hair, set neatly on a stone. She opened it. There were no words, only space, and a faint trace of ink long faded by time. But the final page bore one phrase, etched by fingernail, not pen. If you listen, they will return. The wind shifted, and from deep beneath the earth, or maybe from within her own chest, she heard it. A single breath, a single name, a single word, spoken in the rhythm of remembrance. She closed the book and turned to leave, but the candle she had passed on her way in now stood lit, though the wind had not touched it, though the flame had no wick. It simply burned, steady, silent, knowing. And far below the mountain, in a village tucked against the woods, someone awoke, crying, not from fear, not from pain, from recognition. They had heard the chant again, not in their ears, in their bones. Because the chant was never just words. It was memory carried by breath. It was longing spoken into dark. It was grief refusing to be quiet. And it lives still, not in scrolls, not in halls, not even in the cracked bell that once sang it. It lives in every whisper, spoken into candlelight with a trembling heart. And when the time is right, when sorrow opens the mouth, when devotion bends the knee, When silence becomes unbearable, it will rise again, not to awaken the dead, but to remind the living that no call goes unanswered, no voice is forgotten, and the veil listens.